Hello, global gardeners. It's Monday. It's time to get your gardening week started with your favorite time, the Gardener Scott Community Time, where we get your questions answered and you get to meet some people that you might not be aware of, like our guest today. Now, my voice is a little scratchy. Apologize for that. It's the time of year when the winds blow in and my allergies start kicking up. But it's okay because I'm not doing all the talking today. We can add Enoch Graham from the Urban Gardener channel. Great to have you here, Enoch. How are you doing today?
Doing great, Scott. Really great to be here on your channel with you this week. It's really exciting. I really enjoy your show, so to be a guest is a real big honor. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks. And we truly have a global audience. I've already seen people checking in from all parts of the world and all parts of the U.S. We've got Dee in Florida and Lauren in Washington, and of course Pat is just down the road from me here in Colorado. So as questions pop up, we'll go ahead and answer the questions. But I like your story. I like your channel. I like the information, everything from potatoes in boxes to lots of other just general gardening information. How did you get started and the concept behind the urban gardener?
Yeah, well, as I tell on my story, I had a friend, well, I'd say about 12 years ago. He gave me a cucumber start, and if you can see in the background, I got tons of house plants. I've been doing
Yeah.
that since I was a kid. My mother was great with house plants and all of that. So I loved house plants, but this friend gave me a cucumber start, which I had no clue about growing anything as far as food was concerned. And so immediately I went to YouTube to start finding information about how to take care of a food bearing plant. And I only lived in an apartment at the time. So we only had this little balcony. And so I just got it a bigger pot, got it some soil. We put it out on the balcony. I made sure it was watered throughout the summer. And that thing just took over the whole balcony. I mean,
Yeah.
it grew all over the place, and it had a ton of the cucumbers growing on it. My daughter loves cucumbers, and when I finally picked some off of there, and we were eating them with a dinner one night, I mean, it was like a big light bulb went off. It was like the growing food is the way to go. And so like my obsession with that just happened. And luckily for me, just that winter I moved here to Southern Oregon and got myself just a little bit more space. I mean,
Yeah.
I had a back cement patio. We've actually got a really cool flat carport rooftop, in some alleyway space that I learned to take over because of a neighbor who was actually growing that spring in his alleyway. So I started expanding into those spaces. But yeah, just growing food in small spaces was really became a real big, again, obsession for me.
Nice.
I just dug right in, started building elevated beds, started utilizing buckets and all sorts of things in order to grow food out of because, having that limited space, but yet this obsession, I had to figure out how to utilize every bit of it. And so that was kind of the first end of the concept. I started sharing on a Facebook group, and then I had some friends and some family who were like, "Hey, you should think about trying starting a channel on YouTube
Cool.
and share all of this with people." And that's kind of where it all started, the urban gardener, growing in small spaces.
And so on your channel, you actually showed quite a few things that you can do in a small space. And I get questions like that all the time. People wanting to garden, but feeling like they just don't have enough room to garden. And you obviously grew a monster cucumber on a balcony. What are some of your
Yeah.
tips for new gardeners who aren't so sure that they have enough space?
Yeah, I think overall, if you're able to if you have small space, even if it's a balcony, like I said, just getting yourself a couple of, like we've got on our channel, these really cool water wicking buckets, which you can obtain
Mhm.
from almost anywhere. Restaurants, bakeries will give them to you for free. as opposed to say buying them from a, like a Home Depot or something like that. But you can get them for free. They're really inexpensive. You got good 5 gallons worth of space for root growth. And you can get just a couple of those on a balcony and grow, like I said, tomato plants, cucumbers, all sorts of stuff. I've grown carrots and, broccoli and just all sorts of things out of these little buckets. So, if you're
Yeah.
limited to that sort of space, you can still grow something, and I find the empowerment of growing something similar to what I was talking about with my cucumber story, just to be exceptional. So, if you're looking to do that, you could do that. If you got some, maybe a patio or something, like I said, we utilize these. We just built up these little elevated beds that you can use, and I feel like I almost got a really cool backyard garden with all of the cool little beds I've got, and
Yeah.
so those are really good to do. And again, you can I put the buckets, containers, all sorts of stuff. Another big thing though too with small spaces is, and this is something that took me just a little bit to really figure out, but is vertical growth. So
Yeah.
looking for things that your plants can climb up, and you can kind of control their growth in an upward fashion, utilize that space instead of letting them spread out like a lot of plants like to do. So I've done that with a
Absolutely.
few, like cattle panel, or I have friends who find things around the neighborhood who like one of them has like an old like bed spring frame,
Oh yeah.
and I mean, grow up, just got to be kind of creative with a lot of stuff when it comes to small spaces, but there's just
Yeah.
so much you can actually do. You don't really need the
And
big
and you've got a
yard.
couple of those videos that you show how to do the buckets. In fact, I think that's actually one of your best performing videos is the bucket system. And
Y-
you make it look easy because it really is easy.
yeah, it's not, it really isn't that hard at all. I mean, it's just, you need it. I think the toughest thing about it all is finding yourself and getting a nice little 3-inch hole drill, bit for your drill, and then a little drill, and you do that. You drill some holes. You get like a little net pot. You got 2 buckets together, put them together, and boom, you're all set. You just
Yeah.
need some soil and plants at that point.
Yeah. Nice. Nice. So in an urban environment, growing food, obviously cucumbers are high on your daughter's list. What do you find are some of the easier plants as you've in relatively recently you've started your gardening journey, and so which are the ones that you like to grow the most because you've had the success?
Well, my favorite of growing anything I think works really well in those buckets is peppers. I love growing pepper plants. I live in Southern Oregon. Pepper plants do really well in my area, especially because it's a real warmer climate. But um, there's so many varieties of them, and they grow in so many different temperaments, each of the plants, so I've had fun growing those over the years. In fact, like I was saying, we had this flat carport rooftop. I had like a garden of like 30 plus different varieties of peppers growing up on this rooftop in
Nice.
all of those 5 gallon buckets. But those, I again, like you said, cucumbers. I don't recommend trying to grow, like say in the buckets, large size tomatoes, but I grow a ton of like cherry tomatoes in those
Okay.
things. Those do really well. And again, all sorts of stuff that we grow throughout the spaces that I have there. I am right now in the cold season, so we're trying to grow some lettuces and
Yep.
spinach and those
Yep.
things, which I find not too hard. I just sprinkle out some seed, and they just seem to do pretty well. And yeah, peas and beans, I
I
suppose.
like peas and
Depending on,
beans.
yeah, depending on, cold season for the peas, when it starts getting warmer, you get the beans going. Those things just go. And again, utilizing that vertical space too.
I actually have garlic growing in some buckets this year. I've got garlic in my regular raised beds as well, but I wanted just to demonstrate and to your point as well, you can grow just about anything in a bucket in a limited space. And now Patty's wondering, doing the container gardening and being concerned about airflow and the idea of elevating some of the buckets on concrete blocks to increase the airflow. Have you tried anything like that?
Um, No, well, I've got a couple of things. I haven't like done it on purpose, but I have like a space that has like a little kind of blocks on it, and I've kind of like stacked them up around and all of that. But I can definitely see the advantage of allowing the plants a little room to breathe, which I kind of try to do on most parts. But I'm one of those guys who likes to stuff as much as I can in any space.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I imagine that, yeah, if you're like stacking them up just a little bit, alternating containers in order to allow them to have a little bit of airflow space
Yeah.
is a good idea.
Or if you've got more room, because I'm like you too. I think that's one of the problems a lot of us have is where we take our buckets or containers and we put them side by side and we're growing a lot of plants. And sometimes it's just having the thought that you don't need to cram everything into the same space and you can just spread the buckets apart, and that
Yeah.
also improves the airflow or keep the plants pruned, especially like you're talking about the big
Yes.
tomatoes. If you've got a big
Hmm.
indeterminate tomato growing, often pruning off some of the extra branches can make a big difference as well.
Yeah, I find that with a lot of things, again, back to cucumbers, I grow plenty of those. I've got those trellised up, and sometimes they'll spread out and they want to go beyond the trellis, into some of the other spaces. So those limbs, they come right off because again, we're trying to control
Yeah.
for our space that we have available. So we want to make sure that our plants aren't taking over other spaces. And it is actually one reason why I don't grow climbing beans on my back patio area anymore.
Okay.
Because those things will take over anything. They'll find their way all over the place, and they grow so fast once they really start getting into their growing stages. Yeah, so I've got to keep those cut back where I grow them in my other space, but I tried one year to grow them in my back patio, and then they were just a monster. So,
That's crazy.
yeah.
Well, thank you, Patty. Patty, thank you for that super chat. We're glad to help you with that answer as well. The container gardening, I think, is a great opportunity not only for the space issues, but the the new gardeners who don't want to spend a lot of money. And you're talking about the bed frame, and I have it in some of my earlier videos where a bunk bed, the base of a bunk bed, the metal
Yeah.
slats I
Yeah.
use to make a trellis as well. And so you can pick up stuff that other people's throwing away, put a couple
Hmm.
buckets in front of it to control the beans or the cucumbers or whatever. And now you've got a small garden in an urban setting and you've essentially spent no money. Are you getting, I get my buckets for free from my supermarket. I go to the bakery section and ask
Yep.
for the frosting buckets. What do you do for yours?
Almost the exact same thing. I've gone to a couple of restaurants early on where I got a lot of my buckets. But yeah, I have a supermarket just down the street, and I think it was, I don't know, many years ago, I was just driving around, um, picking up some things, doing some errands, and I ended up driving back behind the supermarket. Noticed they had all these buckets just stacked up back there. I was
Yeah.
like, you know what? I need to go get those things. So it was just as simple as going in there to the customer service desk and asking them, and they were more than happy to give them to
Yeah.
me and let me take them. When it comes to those things, you'll find that, when it goes down to it, you don't need to spend all that money. I think they charge like $5, $6 anymore for those buckets a piece.
Yeah.
If you can get them for free, that's the way to go.
And sometimes it's just cruising. Bobert Kronos says, I got a storage tote from the dumpster and already had a hole in it. That's awesome. And so, yeah, like you say, you just see the buckets. And thank you, Bobert, for that super chat. And
Yeah.
it's keeping your eyes open that you might come across that stack of buckets outside the door or the storage tote that's in a dumpster.
Mhm.
And, yeah, I think gardeners are proud people, but you don't have to be so proud that you pass by a good free
Yeah.
opportunity to
Yeah. Yeah.
get something to grow your plants in.
I'd rather save the money too, and even if you don't see them in the back, or anything like that, just going in and asking most people, whether it's restaurants, or bakeries or anything like that. If you just ask them, they're most of the time they're more than happy to set them aside for you too. So,
Yeah.
and then you can just come and pick them up, you know, depending on how many you want to use ultimately. But yeah. It's really the way to go than spending all the
Good.
money on that. I like to save money when it comes to things. There's so many, there's so many great things out there, in the gardening world for us to utilize. So many different products and so many people selling stuff, and some of those are really cool, but when it comes down to it, I'd rather be saving my money so that I can, really get the most out of my garden when it comes down to it as far as the value.
Absolutely. And so if you're just joining us, I'm talking with Enoch Graham today, the urban gardener from the Urban Gardener YouTube channel. And I saw that our wonderful moderator Jay is always on top of things, and she put a link to your channel in the comments, and of course I've
Thank
got a
you.
link in my comments as well. And so your channel's still growing. You're still pumping out the videos, but I'm really impressed. And one of the things I wanted to talk about today as well is this new venture that you're moving into. And so it's one of those things. Let me go ahead and show this real quick before
Oh
we
yeah,
miss
yeah,
out
for
on it.
sure.
That Bobert says, save money on pots so you can spend money on plants and super chats. So
Yes.
thanks for
Yes,
that super
indeed.
chat. I appreciate that. And so coming up this weekend, and I'll let you go ahead and say more about it, Enoch. But this last week, you started your very first venture into this
Yeah.
new arena of podcasts, or as you reference it, a live cast.
Yeah.
And I was very impressed with your format, the amount of work that you're putting into it. And so tell us about the Let's Get Growing and what you're doing with this.
Yeah. So I was doing live streams on my channel, and I just, I don't know, it was me and the camera, and I was just talking about whatever, and I just was like, what, I want to spice this up just a little bit, and see if I can't, create something that's just a little bit more unique as far as what I was doing, and so one of the things I've gotten to do with my channel over the last few years is to go out and visit other gardeners. I kind of
Mhm.
pretty much travel up and down the West Coast, from Seattle to Los Angeles, and try to go and meet other gardeners, see their gardens, kind of get their perspectives, and do interviews with them. And when everything kind of went to Zoom during the pandemic and all of that, I discovered StreamYard. And with StreamYard, um, it just opened up all of these possibilities. So my creative mind kind of went to work, and I started thinking of these different ideas about doing segments and talking with different people from different parts of social media when it comes to gardening. And so I had this idea, and it was about a couple of years ago that I actually started the whole idea up. But because of a couple of things, I kind of had to hold it back. A couple of ventures I went on the last couple of years. But this last fall, I decided to, take it on in earnest, and I employed some help with some local friends, and they're helping me produce it and everything. So we've been working really hard on putting this together for the last, 4 or 5 months, and again, finally got to launch it this last week. And like you were mentioning too, we call it a live cast. It's a live stream, streaming live on YouTube every
Yep.
Saturday morning, 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. And when we get done with the live cast at the end of the show, a couple hours later, after I get a chance to edit the audio down, I load it up into podcast players. So we utilize Spotify, and that kind of sends it out to the world as an audio podcast that you can listen to anytime you like. Some people like to listen to their things while they're out in the garden
Oh,
doing all
absolutely.
those different work and all of that, so you can take the show with you out into the garden while you're doing that and listen to some really cool interviews with some really cool people. We've got some great people lined up for this first season, and our seasons are basically running as seasons: spring, summer, and fall.
Okay.
So yeah, and again, we have the pleasure of having you, Gardner Scott, coming up
And
with
when
us
will
this
that
next
be?
week, this next Saturday.
That's
I knew.
right.
Yeah, yeah. I knew when I was launching my first season, there was a nice short list of people that I needed to have on my show, and you were definitely at the top of that short list. So I had to make sure you were helping us open this up. You know, we got our first show last week with our good friend Wendy Fan of wendyland.com. She's just a really amazing, fun, passionate gardener in the
Yeah.
small space realm as well too. And yeah, just it was really great. I mean, it was really cool. We had some Instagram gardeners as one of our segments too, because gardening on Instagram is a huge thing. There's so many really wonderful people doing that out there, and as well as other small channels too. So we have a channel of the week segment that we do as well to introduce people who are watching the show to some other smaller gardening channels out there as well too. So got lots of
Yeah.
really good stuff.
Yeah, and I really like that format, the segment, for a live stream like I'm doing, like today, you're the guest, we talk gardening for the whole time. But yours is a show. I mean, it really
Yeah.
is like any other professionally produced podcast with the different segments. And I was actually quite amazed that you had all the different people that you were interviewing for each of the segments. So you were interviewing someone for that segment on Instagram, and you were interviewing Charles for his section about the other channels, and then you
Yeah.
were interviewing Wendy for the main segment. And so, not that anyone would necessarily get bored talking about gardening, but you're breaking it up and offering all those different perspectives, which I think is great. And it really is professionally produced. I was very impressed by it.
Yeah, well, we can thank my producer, Asia Darling. She's just really awesome. She's spent a lot of real good work over the last last couple of months and all that working to make sure that, like all the buttons there. So you're pushing the buttons for StreamYard here, and you're making sure that Tanya's comment and all of that's coming up there, and everybody else as well too. And I was doing that with some of my earlier StreamYard streams. And I
Uh-huh.
found that, if I wanted to have this idea that I had and do these different segments and have all of this variety on the show, that it was going to be difficult for me to be able to make sure the segment introductions are going on, bringing people on, making sure we've got the correct banners and all of that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So it was really necessary to have somebody else kind of help me out with that. And that's one of the things that really kind of really pushed us to that more professional look and everything. So yeah, she's really the one behind the camera, making sure all of that stuff is running really well. And then me, all I got to do is get in front of the camera and talk about gardening. So
There you go.
my
That's the
part's
best part.
yeah, my part's the easy part when it comes down to it. She does all the real hard work behind the scenes. But again, thanks for the comments too about that. We did work pretty hard to create something that was unique to, the gardening world. And we wanted a show when it came
Yeah.
down to it, something that moved along, gave you a lot of different things, and ultimately too gets to introduce you to different people you might not know that's in the garden social media world. One of the things we did talk about too with one of our guests, our Instagram guest, Amanda of the Ever Hopeful Gardener, we
Hmm.
talked about kind of social media and how social media is anymore, and a lot of people kind of refrain from a lot of the, social media things out there because it's filled with a lot of, let's just say garbage, and when it comes down to it, in order to be able to be on any of these, all my stuff is gardening. I just,
Right.
I open up, say, Facebook, and my Facebook feed is just filled with gardeners and gardening and, different people doing different things. My Instagram's the same. I try to refrain from a lot of that stuff. And because of that, I've gotten to see and meet and talk with a lot of different gardeners that are out there. And the gardening
Yeah.
space is, there's just a wide array of people from all over doing all sorts of different gardening. So, and that was really one of the big goals of the show, was to get out there and reach and talk to and interview as many of them as we can.
Great. Well, and so everyone who's watching, if you just joined us, this is Enoch Graham, the Urban Gardener channel on YouTube. We're talking about the live cast that's coming up on Saturday, and Jay's already given some links to that. And so the
Excellent.
show is about an hour and a half long, like this is, and And when you talk about StreamYard, that's the software I'm using for this show as well. It's just I can't do all the bells and whistles because I'm just by myself, which is why it's awesome that you've got a producer to help put all that together. But the main segment is actually well into the show. You cover a lot of those other segments before you get to the main guest and the main discussion. And so, especially if you're out in the garden and you want to listen to a podcast like that, I it's time. The best I could tell, you do have very specific timing for the different segments. And you could almost use that in the garden as a way to figure out what activities you're going to do. I'm going to be spending 15 minutes putting my pea seeds in the ground while I'm listening to the Instagram guest. And then I'll spend another
Yeah.
15 minutes on this. So I was thinking about that when I was watching the show this weekend, that time segment is also an opportunity to use it for those of us that don't wear a watch when we're in the garden. You know exactly how much time you're spending.
Yeah, exactly. And that was kind of one of the big main ideas of the idea of, say, of the live cast. I am a consumer of podcasts. I listen to a bunch of different podcasts, and
Yeah.
um, that was kind of the idea, with a podcast, and similar with here. You got the one main guest that you're talking to, and it's a long form interview. So we wanted to kind of split that idea a little bit with the whole idea of a segmented show with different segments, but then have that one main guest that's going to take up about 45 minutes, half an hour to 45-minute type of discussion with them, in a more podcast style
Yeah.
interview. Yeah. And again, just to have those different segments too, so maybe you only got so much time to listen to something, so you're not breaking in the middle of a conversation. You get the chance, like you're saying, to listen to that 15 minutes while you're out doing this sort of thing of the Instagram segment. And maybe you've got the next one you can listen to on a break doing something else, and you got
Yeah.
10 minutes and you can kind of break it up if you have to, kind of thing. But yeah, um, I think it's a really good format. And then
Yeah.
again, too, comes down to the idea of keeping the show moving along too, and giving people a good wide variety of things that we can cover, when it comes down to it.
Well, so with that idea, getting to a variety of things that we can cover, Family
Oh yeah.
Grows is wondering if you have a basic container potting soil recipe to share with. They've got peat moss and perlite and compost, but want an idea of a ratio. Do you make your own mixes?
I try to make as much as I can. Sometimes I'm mixing up different things that I get, on discount and stuff like that. Again, I try to be as frugal as I possibly can with a lot of stuff. But yeah, I do a lot of mixing if I can. I use like cocoa coir and peat moss, like they suggested as well. Compost. I get compost from some friends at Compost, as well as I purchase some from a local composting facility, and and they're talking a little bit about ratios there. I probably use like 2 to 1 1. So I'll use like I think cocoa coir. I'll use a couple of those to like a good bucket of compost, and then another bucket of like perlite
Yeah.
or vermiculite as well too, that sort of stuff. Try to add in some worm
Yep.
castings, things like that as well too.
I've got a few videos where I show the basic mixes that I make, and I do the same basic idea. I tend to use peat moss, but this year I am using more of the cocoa coir as well. And it's about 2 parts of the
Yeah.
peat or the core, and I use 1 part of either perlite or vermiculite, and then I have 1 part of compost. For containers, I'd mix it up a little bit. So that's my basic recipe for potting mixes. So when I start my seeds and my seedlings, and I'll move them into that potting mix and then go outside, it's basic. But for containers that are actually going to be supporting the plants for a long period of time, they're not going into the ground, that's when I will often add an extra component of the compost and the worm castings. And then I'll also add a fertilizer component. You had Charles Malky on your show. Actually, Charles is going to be on my show here in a couple weeks with
Oh,
IV
yes.
Organics, and they have that nice 333 organic fertilizer blend that includes all of the macronutrients. And so I've been adding that into
Hmm.
my container gardening mix because I think too often we don't recognize that a container needs more nutrients. The soil
Hmm.
has got all the soil life, and we are mixing compost and everything else into it.
Yeah.
Whereas in a container, you might not have all of that soil life breaking down the compost and breaking down the organic material. And so you do have
Hmm.
to give a boost to get that fertilizer to support the plants until you get some life built up in it.
Yeah, yeah, and definitely with containers too, there's a lot of, when you're watering, you're really kind of washing some of that,
Yeah,
through. And so
absolutely.
again, too, you're wanting to add maybe just fertilizer, maybe just a little bit more than you were for your in-ground gardens, in so, like if it's like I'm once a month, trying to spread out a little bit of fertilizer, I might go once every couple weeks or so with a container,
Yeah.
and just kind of tossing a little handful of that 333 that Charles has in there, just to kind of keep those nutrients flowing through the container instead of just washing them out. And I think that's also one of the real benefits of like those water wicking containers we're talking about with the buckets too, is that what you're doing there is you're also allowing your containers just to kind of absorb water up
Right.
versus trying to wash from below, from the top. I mean, you still got to water from the top every now and then with those anyways, but for the most part, that root system's soaking the water up, which also helps to retain some of those nutrients than
Exactly.
instead of washing them through. So it is a benefit of having those, because those end up being almost like an in-ground type of container. That's the real cool thing with them. But if you don't have that sort of wicking system and you have just a regular container and you're hand washing and hand watering your plants, it's going to wash out a lot of those nutrients. So you're definitely correct about making sure that you add those fertilizer components.
Yeah. Especially the nitrogen. The phosphorus and the potassium don't tend to move through the soil very readily, but every time you're watering or it's raining, that nitrogen is gradually leaching out of that container. So,
Hmm.
I don't do as much container gardening because everything is in raised beds or in the ground, but that is the one area that I do have to focus more on fertilizers is in the containers. And people who are doing, like we talked about earlier, you got your small urban garden and you're doing primarily the containers and wondering why your plants aren't doing well. It could be just like you're talking about. You need to fertilize them twice as much as other in-ground
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
raised beds, depending on how good your soil is.
Yeah, yeah, and I like to use also another real good component too is if you can find a good fish emulsion or something, those
Yep.
sort of things in order to really get in that nitrogen and put that into your containers. I find that really works well too in my garden.
Absolutely. So, Patrick, a regular, thank you so much. And I completely agree with you. Another stellar double header with Enoch Graham from the Urban Gardener channel. I've had some guests on in recent weeks, and we really have had some good shows and good discussions. And Family
Yeah,
Grows is also saying, thank you so much. Love your channel, Gardener Scott. Thank you so much. And check out the Urban Gardener channel. I'm always trying to promote smaller channels. Now your channel is actually starting to venture into the realm of a bigger channel, but you're still in that area where you want all the subscribers and viewers that you can get. And that's why I want to
that's
send
right.
people over to your channel because you're really doing some good stuff there that I think people would be interested in. And you are, and so I want to make sure that this sounds the way I'm intending it.
Oh.
Um, your live cast is very professionally produced and it looks great and it makes you look like this gardening professional. But you are just a regular guy with a regular backyard, just growing like all the rest of us. You aren't a classically trained university degreed
Yeah.
horticulturist in your urban garden.
Yeah, yeah, just like I said, I just came about this, with one little plant, just a little over a decade ago, and I've just kind of self-taught and, just out there working with my garden to learn all of the different aspects of things. I'm trying different things all the time, so I'm learning as I go kind of thing. And that was one of the real things right off the bat when I started my channel was, I didn't want to be kind of confused as one of these garden teachers in a sense. I wanted to kind of teach in a way, but by showing as I go kind of thing, because it's a learning process. And if,
Yeah,
for people who've watched my channel over the years now have, kind of gone on this journey with me to, see what I'm figuring out, see what I'm learning, because, that, I mean, really that's gardening in a sense, you get, even if you kind of read some books or you get a good general idea of a lot of things, it's all about the experience ultimately when you get out there and start doing that and getting your hands in the
absolutely.
soil and start working with plants and seeing how they grow and trying different things each year in order to improve things and all of that. That's just been my adventure, and I just kind of try to share that when it comes down to it. So again, yeah, I'm not trained in gardening or haven't even taken any gardening classes really, other than watching your YouTube channel for most of my
Oh,
garden
thanks.
knowledge I need to.
Thanks. And so here's a new one, possibly for you. I have a video from, I think, 5 years ago where I show how I make comfrey tea. And this last year I talked about stinging nettles. I grew stinging nettles for the purpose of turning it into a fertilizer to go in the garden. And I actually have this video planned coming up here in a couple months. Uh, have you done this where you just take all the weeds in your garden and make a tea out of it, or an extract is the way I refer to it because
Right.
you're soaking it in water? Have you done this yet to get that nitrogen into your
No, the
garden?
most I've actually done is some compost teas or worm teas that I've done, just by, utilizing a bucket again and a little pump that pumps into the bucket and just kind of get that stuff flowing around. And I've used those as far as that goes. But as far as weeds or comfrey or anything, I have not actually tried that. But that would be
I'd
one
suggest you
question
try
I
it.
have. Yeah, this be one question I have for you though, too, because it's something I see all over social media all the time is people utilizing bananas in that same sort of way. Have
Okay,
you
so
seen this?
yeah, so to Jeremy's point, one of the reasons that it's such a great idea to make your own nitrogen fertilizer with weeds, and it's more than nitrogen because a lot of these weeds, dandelions for instance, have a really deep tap root, and they're going into the soil and they're drawing up in all the mineral components and the nutrient components into their own leaves. And so when you pull a dandelion and soak it in water, you're now putting all of that back into the soil if you use it as a fertilizer, which is why it can be so effective. But when it comes to eggshells and banana peels and some of those things, there's some of that. There are some of those nutrients that can be used, but I'm not an advocate of most of it because the form that the potassium takes in the banana is different than the form that potassium takes
Okay.
in the soil. And so you may bury banana peels around your plants and you're really not introducing any potassium that plant can uptake. And the same with an eggshell. You could put an eggshell in the ground, but you're really not introducing any calcium that the plant can absorb. You, I think, are in a better sense feeding the soil organisms to make a healthier overall soil. But now those quick fixes that you see that will boost your plants, it really doesn't work that way.
I find that too. It seems like some of that really popular, fun stuff people like to share all over the place just really isn't usually the benefit that they say it is when it comes down to it. But I thought that one was kind of a fun one. I knew I had
Yeah.
to figure that out.
Well, and and my basic philosophy, and I share this every so often, is that a good garden grows where a good gardener goes. And
Yeah.
how you define yourself as a good gardener, of course, is very subjective. But I think a lot of gardeners who are taking the time to watch videos and to be on social media and to read the books, and they hear that banana peels are going to save their plants, well, they're trying. They're going out into the garden
Yeah.
and they see positive results. Well, the positive results are not because they buried a banana peel. The positive results are that that's one of many things that they've learned. They're watering their plants more attentively.
Yeah.
They're protecting the plants. They're pruning the plants, and it's all those extra things that a good gardener is doing that really leads to the success, and not just one application of Epsom salts or whatever else it
Right.
happens to be that people are talking about.
Yeah, Epsom salts is another one that I had to learn a little bit too. Again, on the same sort of sense, highly recommended, but I think that your philosophy on that is probably the more correct when it comes down to it, is that you're just involved with your garden, you're getting out there, you're doing things, so that's why you're seeing the improvements, which makes a lot of
Absolutely.
sense. Just makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, because there's Shandy's Garden is saying when you make compost tea and bubble it with a small sunken aquarium pump and tube, you actually aerate it and you're stirring it so it doesn't smell as much. And that's the big thing, and that's why I try to differentiate between teas and extracts, because a tea where you aerate it, and for me that's just too much work. You are promoting the aerobic bacteria, and it's the aerobic bacteria that's living in the compost and that lives in our soil. If you do like I typically do with my weeds and my comfrey and the stinging nettle, and don't aerate it, it stinks because it's the anaerobic bacteria that is starting to break down that material and helping that leaf or stem cause extract the nutrients into the water. And so when I use an extract, it's smelly and it's got anaerobic bacteria, but once it goes into the soil, that anaerobic bacteria dies very quickly, and the aerobic bacteria
Okay.
is what's alive. So when you said that you are doing like a compost tea, have you gone through this whole process where you bubble it and keep the active aerobic bacteria, or are you lazy like me and just make an extract and accept that it's going to smell?
Well, I've done kind of both, kind of maybe not intentionally in a sense though. I've started. I use the pump. And have the bubbling go, and I've had situation where it's popped off before, and so it just sat there until I got back to it and everything. So I've kind of had both situations unintentionally, but
Okay.
the intention was to actually have it aerated and do that sort of thing. I
Okay.
think more in my mind though was actually, because I utilize a kind of a tea bag. I don't just dump it into it, so I use like a tea bag kind of situation, so the
Okay.
water flowing just to kind of move that through and to get it going and all of that, to get as much out of the tea bag as possible. At least that's the idea of it. And
Yeah.
but I found that it works pretty good, both in a foliar feed, and then I just kind of use the rest of
Well,
it as a
that's
as a
what I was
drench in a sense.
that's what I was just thinking, and I was actually going to bring up that point as well. That I prefer to use my compost in the soil to
Yeah.
improve the soil, but there are studies that show as a foliar feed that it really can be beneficial and actually can act as a deterrence for some plant diseases if you use an aerobic compost tea as a
Hmm.
foliar feed. It actually can be beneficial.
Yeah, and that was when I started doing that. I actually, when I was started foliar feeding with like a worm tea and some, um, I've noticed that that's one of the situations in my garden. I wasn't having as much plant die off through diseases and things like that. That's something that really did improve it.
Yeah,
But I will have to get in and try just doing a regular one and start using that as a soil drench for sure.
there you go. Do you have your own worms? Tanya is asking about the green stalk specifically, and we can get to that in a minute. But are you doing your own worms to get your own worm castings?
That is one of my, hopefully my upcoming projects for this year is to finally build one of my own worm bins and get that sort of thing set up. I actually buy and purchase most of my worm castings. Yeah.
Okay. Because
But yeah,
I've got the green stock, and I love my green stock, and I've made videos about it. And this gets back to what we were talking about earlier with our blends, our mixes for containers. And because I have my own worms, and because I like to add that nutrient component to the container soil, to Tanya's specific question, I do use worm castings in my green stock because the soil I'm using in my green stock is one that I make, and I've got my own worm castings to throw into it.
yeah, yeah. And actually, my worm bin project has been on my list the last at least 2 seasons. And I just get so involved with that. I'm saying I got so many things going on, and I got so many projects and things like that that it's just one of those things that kept getting put off. But the reason why I had that on my list was because of your videos on doing and building worm bins and
Okay, nice.
maintaining your worms and all of that. So that's one of the, I was like, you know what, I've got to actually try this, I've got to do this. So definitely I really appreciate those videos, and
Oh, good.
I'll be watching them again here real soon, so I get a catch up lesson on putting those together. But again, I'm really excited about that project. I've wanted to have
Good.
worms for a while, and I really want to be able to try to produce my own worm castings. I think that would be great.
Well, go for it. I know what you're talking about with getting busy because I've got worm castings that need to be harvested to be used in my potting mixes, but I'm going to be making a video about it. So as you know, when you start getting into that video mode, it
Yep.
definitely affects when you do things and how you do
Yep.
things. And I should have harvested my castings a couple weeks ago, but now I'm waiting to do the video on it, and the video is going to come out in a couple weeks, and it's throwing my whole worm schedule off. So
Yeah.
I've actually got more worm videos coming where I'll be talking about using the castings in the garden, and then I'm going to be harvesting the castings a little bit differently this time. And so
Okay.
if it works as planned, I keep my worms in separate bins
Yeah.
because they've doubled in population and they're expanding. But what I'm going to do now is actually kind of create a double story worm system, because
Okay.
I think if you manage, and you probably will get this from my videos, I don't have a drain plug. I just manage the moisture levels within the worm bin. And a lot of the
Yeah.
commercial or the retail systems that you buy, they're like in towers, and they always
Yeah.
have the drain, and it's also anaerobic, and it smells when you drain out that worm liquid. And so I just try to control through the bedding and the food how much moisture gets into that bed. But
Yeah.
what I'm going to try this time is drilling holes in one of those bins, not for drainage, but for the migration of the worms. And
Yeah.
so in the bottom bin, will have all of the food. And when it comes time to harvest the worm castings, I'll put all of the worms and the worm castings in the top, and then let them migrate down through those holes into the food below. And I'm guessing, I'm expecting that's going to be a much easier way to harvest the castings and not have to worry about picking out all the worms along the way.
So when you're doing it, then you're probably still having migration though, but from side to side of the bucket.
Right. And that's
So
what I've done is I will move the castings and the worms to one side of the bucket,
yeah.
and then I'll put new food on the other side. And it just seems to take it works. It's migration. The
Yeah.
worms will move to the new food, but it just seems to take a long time. So I'm trying to figure out a way that if they drop through the hole, they're not going to be climbing back up into the castings, because that's the problem. They just migrate
Yeah.
back and forth. They go from
Yeah.
the castings that are ready to harvest to the new food, and then they come back, and they're just crawling all over
Right.
that worm bin. So anyway, look for
Hey, you'll get to you.
if it works, that video's coming.
Yeah. So, and again, and the idea I'm seeing is that you're going to be able to get to utilize that whole bucket though, and
Yeah.
feeding, and they're just going to do whatever, and then you're going to have them move up out of it. That's just, yeah, that's a great idea.
Yeah. So we'll see if that
I,
works. So keep your
well,
fingers
hopefully
crossed.
you get that out soon before I get my worm buckets or my worm thing situated, and I can utilize that same idea too, because I think that
Yeah.
sounds good.
Well, there you go. You can watch the other 3 videos right now that'll give you an ABC approach, and by then hopefully it'll come out. So thank
Yeah.
you, Tanya's Townhouse Garden, and we appreciate you as well. I'm glad we could answer your question. So thank you for that. And uh, didn't think we'd be talking worms today, but you never know where gardening is going to take you when you actually
That's
start
right.
talking about containers and worms and teas and extracts and all the other
Yeah.
kind of fun things. LP says one of the first worm videos I saw was Gardener Scott's. I now have 4 worm bins in my basement, and this will be my 4th year worm farming. And you're very welcome, LP. So this is what you're getting yourself into, Enoch, is once you get started, it's so easy, and you really, worm castings are not cheap when you buy them, as you well know.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so when you make it yourself, it really is another one of those gardening uh, hobby aspects that starts off as, yeah, I'll try this, and then before you know it, it's taking over your basement or your
Yeah.
spare room or wherever you've
And I'm
got your worms.
so used to that. I am so used to that. Believe me, it's almost everything when it comes to gardening, especially gardening in general. It's just one thing starts and leads to another and leads to another and leads to another.
There you go.
But yeah,
And
another thing about worm bins and all that sort of stuff too, it's another one of those, great general ideas for small space gardening. You're not
yeah,
got much space, and another way to kind of, again, as you mentioned too, to save some money on what you're utilizing in your inputs for your garden. And you can't beat worm castings when it comes to, just a general input for whatever you're doing in your garden.
absolutely, absolutely. And I think everyone should get into it. Scott Head is on. He was a guest on the show recently with the Scott Head channel, another channel
Oh,
I
yes, I
love
watch
watching.
Scott's channel too.
There you
It's good to
go.
see Scott here. Hi.
And he says he's holding off the worm bins until he sees the I guess the results of it. So the one thing about worm bins, and this holds true for you as well, Scott, for both you and Enoch, it takes a few months for the worms to reach the point that the castings are ready to harvest. So I say
Yeah.
get started right now, get your worms going, get the activity happening, and then yeah, by the time you're ready to harvest, hopefully my video will be out and you can see an easy way to harvest. I do have a video that shows how I separate the castings from the worms, but it's more work than I like to put into it. So that's why I'm trying to figure
Yeah.
out an easier way with a new video.
Excellent. Excellent. And again, continuing, one of the general things about gardening too is just to get out and try some things, experiment with things, and just have fun in your garden, fun with the different projects that you're doing with your garden, when it comes down to it. That's probably just the
Absolutely.
best aspect of gardening anyways. It's just to have fun trying things out and seeing what works and what doesn't work as well.
Absolutely. And so if you're just joining us, Enoch Graham from the Urban Gardener channel is with us today. I'm going to switch over real quick. We're at 270 viewers. And so if you're just checking in, go ahead and check out the Urban Gardener channel. And we'll keep talking gardening here until we get to the end of the show. And one of the things we talked about earlier was that I'm going to be on Enoch's livecast this Saturday, a brand new production for gardeners to be able to listen to it live. And so this live stream, a lot of people listen to this as a podcast in the garden, and that's one reason why I try to have the format that I have. But
Yeah.
you've specifically set up the live cast that starts off as a YouTube live stream and then turns into a podcast and all these different podcast services. You're thinking
Yeah.
about that gardener in the garden working as they're
Yeah.
listening to you and your guests, right?
Yeah, I mean, and again, too, that's just me. I'm a big consumer of a lot of different podcasts out there for that same reason. I spend sometimes hours out there working on different things, and I'll be switching around, checking out different. There's a few different good gardening podcasts that are already out there,
Mm-hmm.
hopefully, and I'm going to have a few of them on as guests coming up here as well. Um, One I'll mention too is Greg Peterson. He's got a really great gardening podcast. He'll be one of our upcoming guests here in the
Oh, good.
coming weeks. And again, because you're out there doing things, we're utilizing our hands and our eyes too, when it comes down to it. And so, being able to sit down and watch a show sometimes isn't the best thing for our time. And so that was one of the big things that we wanted to make sure with our show was that we'll get everybody on YouTube to watch the show, but then also offer them that ability to listen to our show on the go whenever they want.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nice. Nice. I also want to give a shout out to In the Garden with Eli and Kate. Eli was a recent guest on the show as well. Eli and Kate and I are doing some collaboration videos as the season
Okay.
progresses. Their first one just came out yesterday, and mine comes out today. And we're trying to have a lot of fun with it. So make sure you check out that video and see what we're doing. And I was also on your channel last year doing a collaboration video.
Yeah.
And I know that whole thing didn't turn out the way that you had hoped, but why don't you share a
Yeah.
little bit about what you were trying to do and why I and some others were doing collaboration videos on your channel?
Yeah. Well, without going into the names of anybody or anything like that, I was selected by a company to do a national gardening competition where we all competed in different gardening categories. There was the hottest pepper, there was the largest squash. I think the same was largest sweet potato, and then the
And biggest
largest
tomato, that's where I
and the
came in.
biggest, yeah, and then the biggest tomato. There were a couple of voting categories as well, but the biggest tomato, what my idea was, but again, because I've gotten to meet and I enjoy a lot of different gardeners out there who have channels and share their gardening knowledge, who have more gardening knowledge than I do in general. So I asked you as well as a few other people to come on and do these videos to help give me some ideas and some tips about, really what would work best for each of those categories. So I had you on for our largest tomato video, and it really, all of those tips that you gave me, I got to utilize in the garden.
Oh,
and
good.
and even though we weren't able to submit for the competition and do that, I'm telling you what, I would have won that largest tomato category because of some of your tips. I mean, we got near, it was
Nice.
almost 3 pounds. Our tomato
Wow.
came out to almost 3 pounds. So
Wow.
we would have had that category hands down when it came down to it. But yeah,
Oh,
utilize a
good.
lot of those things that you talked about in that video to grow that large tomato. Which again, too, I'd recommend. Even though the competition, that I think that video or any of your videos when it comes to taking care of tomatoes are really great when it comes down to it. Even if you're not trying to grow a 3 pound tomato, you might want a nice decent size,
Right.
beef steak or something like that, a nice big slicer or something. So I definitely recommend utilizing Gardner Scott's advice when it comes
Oh,
down to that,
thanks.
because it really worked out well. I know we would have won that one in the competition too.
Nice.
I think we would have got most of them when it came down to it.
Yeah, that's why I was disappointed to hear it didn't turn out as planned with the
Yeah,
competition. But they are good videos, and there's lots of good information on your channel
yeah,
about those kind of
that's
things.
right. That's right. Yeah.
And that's and I kudos to you because as we've been chatting, you're on your journey, you're learning, you're trying to
Yeah.
get your garden to be the best that it can be, and you are going to others with more information, and that's one of the nice things about your channel is you're showing the interviews with these more experienced gardeners and you're sharing
Yeah.
their information on your channel to help out all the other inexperienced gardeners out there.
Yeah. All right. Well, you know what? I have an unexpected issue coming up, Scott. I
Oh, no
apologize.
problem.
Someone happens to be knocking at the front door.
Okay.
So I might have to
Well,
take just a moment here.
I'll let you go, and when you get back, if you get back, you can join back in with the show.
Yeah, it might just take a minute here.
Okay, no problem. And so while we're waiting for Enoch to get back, excuse me, let's talk about this collaboration that we're doing. We talked with Eli in the live stream recently, and we're doing the tomatoes. And so if you remember, we asked you all to let us choose your choices in our gardens this year. And so the ones that we specifically are going to grow based on your recommendations are the black crim, the sun gold, the black cherry, and the Kellogg's breakfast. Those were the ones that got the most votes, along with Barry's crazy cherry. So those 5 in particular are ones that we are both growing because you all are the ones that said you wanted us to try it. Now I think both both of us are also growing Sun Gold and Sweet Million just because we wanted to. And the same, I think Eli mentioned they're doing Golden Nugget this year. So even though those are the ones that you chose, it ended up being such a great list of so many wonderful varieties. I think we may end up growing everything that we offered you all as an option to help us choose from. So just wanted to share with that because Eli's video came out yesterday and my video is coming out here in a couple hours. And the nice thing about it with the In the Garden with Eli and Kate channel is that Eli tends to be the figurehead and does most of the talking, but Kate is doing more and more appearing on these collaboration videos. So I was really glad to see that, and we had a lot of fun putting those together. So be sure and check out their video and check out my video, and then follow along. That's one of those things that I've seen in some of the comments already, that some of you are also growing some of these varieties that we have decided to grow as a comparison between Scotland and Colorado. Go ahead and follow along as well with some of the varieties. And when we get to the end of the season and we're comparing our results, we'd definitely love to have you tell us in the comments of those videos what your results were. So just something to keep in mind, something to kind of get, I don't want to say get involved because we are all involved in the gardening community, but it's a nice catalyst. If you're looking for something a little bit new to try in the garden, well, do what we're doing, which is growing the same types of plants, the same varieties, as close to the same way as possible. And then we'll see what the results are between our different climates and our specifically different gardens that we're growing in. So I'm looking forward to that, and it was nice to be able to get together and see Kate more in the video. Blue Petunias is saying, I'd love to come on and talk tomatoes later in the season. So a wonderful idea. So anytime you all have an idea, and especially for channels with ideas and collaborations and live streams and all the rest, send me a note to gardenerscott@gardenerscott.com, and that's really a good way to move forward with that. So Blue Petunias, why don't you send me an email, gardenerscott@gardenerscott.com. And I love the idea of talking tomatoes. Tomatoes are so easy to talk about because there's so much that can go right with them and there's so much that can go wrong with them, and all of us have those same experiences over time, it seems. It's just a question of which variety it is that we happen to be growing. So it's a lot of fun when we can actually share not just our successes, but our failures. And I suspect as we're doing this collaboration, I'm not going to have all successes. My tomatoes typically do very well when I grow them in my raised beds, but I'm going to be growing more and more in my greenhouse. And I'm a little trepidatious about that because I get very hot temperatures in summer, and my greenhouse is soaring. At the Galileo garden, the big dome greenhouse that I was growing in, the temperatures there would get up to 110 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 43 degrees Celsius. And it's hard to keep plants growing well when it gets that hot. And I know I'm going to have those same issues in my small home greenhouse. So keep your fingers crossed. And it's one of those issues where in Scotland, it's cooler, it's cloudier, and growing in a greenhouse is the best way to get the fruit. And that's what Eli and Kate are going to be showing. For me, in Colorado, over 7,000 feet elevation with the hot, dry, it's going to be a challenge to do the exact same thing in a greenhouse. So those are some of the things that we'll be showing in future videos, and why I'm really looking forward to doing some of that. So B. Simmons says, hello, Gardner Scott. What are your thoughts on feeding soil like from Steve Solomon, The Intelligent Gardener book? And so I think, and I've said this many, many times before, that soil is the key to a garden's success, because you want that life in your soil. And so when it comes to feeding the soil, I think feeding the soil is more important than feeding the plant. We were talking earlier, and I saw that Enoch just popped back in, so we'll give him a couple seconds to get set up, and then we'll rejoin him. But when we talk fertilizer, and when we talk compost tea, and we talk comfrey tea, and the weed extracts, I do some of that, and it can be a great way to benefit the soil. If we're adding all of that, and that's what Enoch and I were talking about, using some of it as a foliar feed for some of the disease resistance that some of those ingredients can promote, is great. But it's drenching the soil, as Enoch said, that is really the goal. We're feeding the soil with all of these nutrients, with the beneficial bacteria. And when we feed the soil, that feeds the plant. And so too many people rely on fertilizers as a way to feed the plant without a focus on the soil. And I think they're really missing out on that. So I know you were hearing much of that. Enoch, anything you want to add as to feeding the soil and the plants? What's your general take on that as well?
Yeah, same thing. I mean, that's what I've learned in the long run. I probably came with that same kind of concept. I'm just trying to feed my plants and utilizing our fertilizers for that purpose. But when you learn a little bit more, that everything really kind of starts with the soil when it comes down to it. Starts and ends with the soil, is that it's just, feeding those, those little microbes and nematodes and all those little things that are down in that soil that are doing all that work, the fungi and everything, they're all working together in order to create the right environment for your roots to just thrive. So that's really what you're trying to do, is make sure that you're feeding them more so that they can make sure that your plants are, getting the best of everything out of what you're providing them.
And that ties back to what we were talking about at the beginning of the show with bananas in the soil. It's not the bananas that are feeding the plants, it's the microbes that are feeding the plants, and they might just happen to be eating a banana peel that you buried. It's all about the soil life that really makes everything.
Exactly.
And so hopefully you got everything resolved at your front door.
Yeah, I know. And, actually, that was one of the things that I thought with our last live stream, and I was really lucky with that when that happened, was that right after we finished, someone came to the door, and I was like, I need to make a sign to put on my door, and I should have gotten it done before we got this started up and everything, but that's all right.
Yeah, that's a good point. I don't have signs. I don't often get people knocking at the door, but that's really a good consideration if you're in the neighborhood where people are going to be knocking on the door.
Yeah.
Put a sign on there while
we always got people
going.
coming around, or neighbors, or people just, popping in here and there, knocking on the door. So I really got to do that.
Yeah. So Richard Hitchcock is asking, what would you recommend for enriching soil as a general rule without testing? And this is really a good question, because I gardened for probably 20 years, probably 25 years of gardening and learning and growing before I did my first soil test. I would teach classes and tell people to get a soil test done, and then I wasn't getting a soil test done because I was adding compost and I was
Yeah.
using organic mulches that I would
Yep.
turn into the soil at the end of the season. And I think if you take that approach with just basic compost and basic organic materials, the testing, I still think you should get a test because establishing your baseline can be important
Yeah.
in recognizing that your soil is deficient in certain nutrients. But it's all organic material. What are your
Yeah.
thoughts?
Yeah, same thing, if that's in same situation for me. In fact, I still have my soil tester in the other room that's hasn't even gotten out of the package yet
Yeah.
because I haven't done that necessarily. But I probably should, like you said, at least to get kind of a base idea of what my soil composition is. But if you're really just adding some good general compost and you're doing, like you said, that's really if you're not intending on testing your soil or anything and you're looking to keep your soil amended and healthy and all of
Yeah.
that, and especially in an organic matter, you want to make sure that you're utilizing some of the composts and things like that, and again, worm castings, just
Yep.
some of those good things that really help again, with the feeding your soil, making your soil and all of those things have the types of things that they need to really strive and thrive, and that'll really show in your garden
Yeah.
and your
Now, one
plants.
thing that I'm going to be doing, and I've got a video coming out, it's programmed for next month. So I think the baseline, like we're talking about, just figuring out, and a professional soil test is really good because it can tell you if you've got clay or if you've got sand. You might suspect it, but when it can actually be tested and give you the composition of your soil and what nutrients you're deficient in, it's a great way to start. But I've learned over the years and seen some great videos that show you can actually over amend your soil. You can actually get it to the point that it's too rich. One of the channels that I loved watching, they don't make videos anymore, the 1 Yard Revolution. And he
Oh
shows
yes.
that where he just was amending and amending and amending and amending. And in about the fifth year, his plants started suffering. They weren't doing as
Mhm.
well. And he had a soil test done and realized he had too much nitrogen in the soil. He had too many nutrients. And so the plants weren't able to take up a lot of the micronutrients that they needed because the soil
Yeah.
was too rich. And so my video that's coming out and the new approach I'm taking is to start doing soil tests in my beds,
Yeah.
not just assuming that all of the nutrients are going to make it better, and trying to identify that point when the soil is so rich that you actually
Yeah.
should stop amending for a year or two for things to stabilize.
Yeah, if I think if you are in the habit of adding and doing that on a regular basis, it's probably a really good idea to find out whether or not that's happening. And again,
Exactly.
too, I mean, if you're seeing poor results, I mean, if you're doing all right and your plants are thriving and all that, then you probably don't have much to be looking for. But if you're starting to see some poor results in your garden and things that you normally are growing well are not doing well, then that's definitely a real key right there to actually start looking into why and what's going
Exactly.
on with that. Yep.
Exactly. Vanessa's garden is wondering how long to keep liquid fertilizer before it goes bad or doesn't work anymore. So when I use fertilizer, I mix up just as much as I need. I don't typically keep it sitting around because it can lose its effectiveness over time. How do you use liquid fertilizers with this thought in mind as far as mixing it and keeping it or using it as soon as you mix it?
Yeah, I'm not utilizing much for liquid fertilizer other than like the one I mentioned earlier was like I use some fish emulsions
Yeah.
and things like that too for my containers. So again, same thing, you don't want to be keeping fish emulsion around at all. So, that's really going to start stinking up your area.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I kind of mix as I go when it comes to that. And for me, I'm generally using just some dry or, organic fertilizers for my containers and my beds and, all over the place.
Yeah, I tend to use the slow release organic if I'm going to use a fertilizer as well.
Also, that same kind of concept is if we're washing things through, if I'm laying some good dry stuff on top, that's going to give me that extra time, and timing for it to take its time going down, and break down as it's going versus say just putting that liquid fertilizer in and then watering the next time and just kind of pushing it through. So
Yeah, that's a good
kind of
idea,
a,
and that's what I try to do with the organic mulches. And I'll actually use compost as a mulch for that reason as well. Put it on
yeah,
top
yeah.
and
Mulches,
just
exactly.
yeah. And so there, thank you to Greg Daner. Appreciate that super chat. Great show today, guys. Enjoying the back and forth. I'm enjoying the back and forth too. So it's so great to have you here, Enoch, and sharing your thoughts
Yeah.
and ideas. And it's yeah. So I know you're doing a lot of your gardening based on my videos, but of course I like people that are following similar possibilities and options and goals for the garden as I do. I
Yeah.
think that
Yeah.
that makes all of us easier to talk to when we're all doing the same thing. But we don't have to do the same thing. If you got an
Yes.
example of something that you might be doing in your garden that in your mind at least is completely different than what everybody else is doing.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think, a few things. I mean, like I said, I'm growing carrots in elevated beds and containers and things like that, versus in the ground. So I'm really experimenting with a lot of those things that you can do in small spaces in order to try to grow most wide variety of things that you can in your garden versus the typical, tomatoes and things like that. So, as far as that goes, again, back to the idea of like utilizing vertical space and trying
Hmm.
different things in order to optimize my space that I'm utilizing. Um, we grow in alleyways, so there's different things going on
Oh,
there too in order to kind of take up some of those. If you have an alleyway, the city, you've got that 2 feet, that's still, that's off to whatever border or edge of your alleyway that's really you can use for all sorts of stuff. I've created beds and utilized
nice.
containers. In fact, you mentioned growing garlic in containers. That's the one in-ground space that I get to utilize in my area is in those alleyways, and that's where a lot of our garlic grows throughout our
Interesting.
winter time into our early summer. So yeah, so that's kind of the unique thing about what we're doing in my gardens is just trying to utilize
That's a
whatever
great
kind of
idea.
type spaces. Yeah, and that's thanks to my neighbor. I first moved here, and he's a older gentleman who's been growing in his back alleyway space for like 25 years before I came here, and he's just got this really exceptional, just optimizes that space in such a great way. And I remember just my first year when I moved here, I was sitting here thinking about all this gardening stuff. What could I do? And I've got this cement back patio, and I was watching him just plant these things out. And I mean, at one point, he was growing this Mexican corn that was like 14 feet tall, and he had just this really
Wow.
cool line of them, and they were just huge, ears of corn coming off of these things. And I was just so fascinated with how he was able to accomplish that. So at that point, I kind of, took on some of the other spaces in the alleyway that we have here too to try to do the same thing. So
That's nice.
we're kind of like gardening partners in the alleyway when it comes down to it. So
Well, that's a great idea because I think almost all gardeners think that they have to garden within the enclosed space in their backyard or wherever they've set
mhm.
up their garden, and you can literally think outside the fence and
Yeah,
grow in an easement, as I saw Frank mention. The alleyways, any type of easement that you might have on your property, you can still grow plants
yep,
there. You can still garden even if it's not within your backyard, and
yeah.
that's a great opportunity.
Yeah, and it was really, and again, one of those things that I started doing, and when we really expanded on it, that our community just loves. I get neighbors and people from all around all around the neighborhood that walk through the alleyways just to come and check out and see all the really cool things that we're growing out there too.
Nice.
Just a really kind of enhances the neighborhood too, in a unique way.
Yeah. And Scott says he's planted fig trees in a public green space and set up orange flags stakes so the county mowers mow around it. That's actually another. I've known some people that have tried to grow things in public space and the mowers mow them down. But um, yeah, that's a great idea for gardeners of all types, is to find a place. I did a video, I think it was last year, where I was talking about guerrilla gardening, and you can make seed
Yeah.
bombs and try to get flowers growing in a public space. But there's no reason why it can't be edible crops as well that are growing in a public space that might be shared by people just walking by in addition.
Yeah. And those a lot of times if you got at one of those areas, you've got your front yard, then you got a sidewalk, and then sometimes there's a little space
The
that's
hell
right there.
strip is what they call it here.
Yeah, yeah, but when it comes down to it, most communities, the city relies on you to take care of that
Yeah.
space as well, even though it belongs to the city. And you can go ahead and start planting things in there as well too, and grow stuff and take
Yeah.
advantage of all of that. I when I first started gardening and got on YouTube, there was a late bloomer, Kay Cottrell's
Hmm.
garden that she had. I think she's out in the country now, but she had a really cool front yard garden where she really optimized that little space there and grew all sorts of stuff in there, and just
Yeah.
was, it's a really great, as well as your alleyway to be able to do that sort of stuff. I will mention one thing about the mowing though. I don't have a problem with like the city mowing or anything like that, but again, I grow the garlic along the back side of our it's a fence line, and there's an alleyway that runs that way. So I have two alleyways, one that goes this way and then one that kind of tees up down on it. So we grow
Okay.
along this fence line back there, and one of the neighbors that lived on the other side of the that alleyway came out with a mower and mowed down all of my garlic.
Oh
But you
no.
know what? But that's one of the things about garlic and like onions and things like that.
They
They
pop
don't
right
mind a
back.
hair. Yeah, they don't mind a haircut. So
Yeah.
luckily, that's what I had growing in that spaces versus other things and all of that. So I did have to have a conversation with them and let them know that those were garlic that was growing there. And how I figured that out too is I stepped outside one day and I heard a mower out there, as you hear in your neighborhood and most people's places, and didn't think too much of it. But man, it smelled like garlic. I mean, the garlic smell was intense out there, and I was at least a good couple 100 feet from where that space is, and I'm just like, why does it smell like garlic so much?
That's funny.
And then I came up around the corner and noticed them all chopped down, and I was like, oh no. But yeah,
That's
again,
funny.
I was just lucky that that's what was growing in that space.
And so Jen Van Brunt is asking, do you have sunlight limitations in the alleyway? And I can guess an answer to this. So how do you approach what's growing on one side of the fence to what's growing on the other side of the fence as
Yeah,
far as the
okay.
sun?
Yeah, that's a good, as I just mentioned, we've got an alleyway that tees up. So the one that's kind of running in, the leg of the T of, if you would imagine, that one is, it's got buildings on each side, and kind of, I don't know what you say, goes east to west with the sun
Okay.
coming from the east to the west. So it gets a little bit of limitation of sunlight, whereas opposed to my other alleyway is running, or no, that one's the running east to west. The other one's running north to south. So the north to south is getting the limitation, a little bit of the limitation. The one that's going east to west is getting full sunlight throughout the whole day.
Okay.
At least on the north side of the alleyway. So we get a lot of good sun on there, and that's where we mostly grow as far as that goes. And then
Nice.
again, if it's up next to a building, it's getting a little bit of shade, but I really haven't found too much of a problem with most everything I grow there too.
Good. So
Yeah.
Sherry mentions Gilroy, California. I lived not too far from Gilroy a number of years ago. And so in your travels up and down the west coast of the U.S., have you been to Gilroy?
No, actually, it's been on my list to go check out the garlic festival. I don't know if they're doing that right now or if they plan on bringing it back or not. I'm not sure. Maybe Sherry, if she's or she says she used to live there, but yeah, so I'm not sure. But that was definitely one of the stops I wanted to make,
Yeah,
to
you
do
got to
the
do that. Yeah, if they bring it back, definitely do it. We did. My kids still talk about eating garlic ice cream at the
oh wow.
Garlic Gilroy Festival. They were
Yeah.
like 4 and 5 years old at the time, and they still remember eating the garlic ice cream. So it really is a pretty incredible festival. But yeah, you drive for miles and miles and miles, and all you smell is the garlic because
The
it just
garlic fields.
permeates everything, which is really a
Oh,
lot of fun.
I bet it's nice though. I mean, I love garlic, so that's one of my favorite things. Was actually one of my
Oh,
big first
absolutely.
learning curves when it came to growing. Garlic was one of those first things I tried, and I went out there, in springtime, just I'm gonna grow some garlic and plucking these garlic cloves into the ground. And it took me another season or two before I realized, why aren't my garlic turning out well? Until I really figured out, wait a minute, you got to plant those things in the fall, give them that time to, get that that cold stratification in the ground to, so those bulbs are ready to grow and
Yeah.
split. And, that really is what helps them split, when it comes into the next season. And yeah, so it took me a little while to get it down, but once I got it down, garlic is no problem at all. You just put it in the ground, you
Good.
let it do its thing, and it's even in the alleyways, don't have to worry about feeding them or nothing. And I just get these really
Yeah, they're so
great.
tough. You can
Yeah,
ignore them, and they'll still give you garlic.
that's right. Yep.
And so Frank is mentioning I did a video recently where I started tomatoes from seed 3 different ways, and I appreciate that, Frank, because it was enlightening to me. And so I don't know if you've seen that video, Enoch, but how do you start your tomato seeds? Is there a particular method that you found works best for you?
I start my tomatoes. I think I'm down to about 4 to 5 weeks before my last frost, and I'll get them started here indoors. I have a cool little light seed station that I have indoors with some with indoor, just basic shop lights,
Hmm.
and yeah, I get mine started early. I don't do anything more than just getting regular seed starting kit kind of thing, and pluck them in a little bit of soil. I use just a basic, cocoa coir and vermiculite type of thing, until they get grown, and then I transplant them into something, and that's when we start feeding them. But yeah, I'll let them get, just a good few. They get about a good few inches, half a foot tall, and that's
Yeah.
about the time that it's time to get them outside and planted outdoors into all of our different spaces.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, that's the same basic approach I've done, and that's what I talk about in the video. Is I'm doing more and more where I'll be actually starting the seeds in a pot, and that will be the final pot. So, because I've done the same way, I use the peat and the perlite as my primary seed starter mix, and then
Yeah.
I transplant into another pot and then put it out in the garden at about the same size. But I'm experimenting more with bypassing that initial step and just starting them in a pot. And last year, at least, the results were actually pretty amazing to do it that way as opposed to bypassing or using that first step and then transplanting it up. So
Yeah.
it's fun. That's all part of the whole try new things and discover what works and what doesn't work. And I'm starting to modify the way that I've been doing tomatoes for a couple decades now, and it's actually kind of exciting.
Yeah, then again, another fun of the gardening experience is to be able to do that. There's just, what works at one time might not work again later down the road, and you can always change things up and experiment with new things. And I think that's probably one of the things I, find the most fun about the garden is to be able to try all sorts of different stuff, just to test things out when it comes down to it.
Yeah,
Some things that, like you said, some things you're used to doing for so long, you can find better and more efficient methods,
and
and
it's
be
fun
able
to
to
try
utilize
that.
those. We don't have to be
Uh,
stuck in certain ways we do stuff.
Exactly. And Jay is a fantastic moderator. She's always doing behind the scenes research while we're chatting. And she said that the Gilroy Garlic Festival Association announced an indefinite suspension in April of 2022. And then
Mm.
in May 2022, the festival was canceled permanently. So
I
sorry to hear that,
I
because
missed out.
Gilroy
I
was
missed
pretty
out.
incredible. Maybe someday they will put it back into place, but at least from last year, it doesn't look like it's going to happen again. So thank you, Jay, for looking into that. That is a little bit disappointing. Just
Yeah,
having been there, it is one of those things that people just enjoyed so much. So keep your fingers crossed. Maybe it'll come back someday.
maybe there'll be
Well,
just
I
enough
want to
demand.
thank you, Enoch, for being here, and I'll see you again on Saturday as we do your live cast over at the
Yeah,
Urban Gardener channel, and I'll be sure and put a link to that in the description below for this live stream that I'm doing. And so for all of
yeah,
you, check that out. You can check out the Urban Gardener channel to see the video that was just done, and I'm not exactly sure how the podcast world works, but once you've got your first podcast loaded to all of the different services, people can then subscribe and become
yeah.
a listener for everyone after that, right?
Yeah, yeah, definitely subscribe wherever you can find them. I utilize Castbox is the one that I utilize. A lot of people are on Spotify where we actually load up the show, but it should be able to find that. We do have a website though too. It's called letsgetgrowing.live. And there on there has like an RSS feed. So if you're not finding it in your podcast player, you can go there and kind of copy and paste it into the search bar. Should help you find that as well too. So I encourage everybody to
Yeah,
subscribe in all different ways, help out the show, come enjoy the show, especially this next Saturday as we have Gardener Scott on with us, and we'll dig into his
absolutely.
gardening story. That's one of our main objectives with our show, is to just get into everybody's garden story and talk about how we got gardening and what we enjoy the most about it, and all of the other little
All
things that
that
go
fun
along
stuff.
with that too. So really excited
Yeah.
about seeing you coming up here this next week, Gardner. Scott,
Uh,
thank you
oh,
so
my
much for having
pleasure.
me today.
And just to be clear, that your YouTube channel is The Urban Gardener, but the podcast is Let's Get Growing.
That's right. Yep. Let's Get
Yeah.
Growing show on the Urban Gardener channel.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for being here. Always nice to expose people like you to my audience
Yeah,
and the entire world. So let's hope that people are checking that out, and I hope to see everybody there on Saturday. So thanks, Enoch.
absolutely.
I appreciate you joining us today. Thanks so much for your time.
You got it. Thanks again for having us on.
Great. So there you have it. Had a great show today. Lots of good information. Do look for what's coming up on Saturday. Look for the link here. I know Jay has already posted a link in the comments as well, and so it was nice to have this chat, and there's more to come, of course. Always great to have you all here on Monday. And as you might guess, I'll be back next Monday, and we'll do this all over again. No guests next week. It's just going to be me, and we're going to talk some gardening information that I know you are probably all interested in. So, same time, same channel, next Monday, and I'll see you there. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.